Game of the Year is always a somewhat misleading accolade, because unlike the various awards shows of other entertainment and cultural media, there isn't an official body dedicated to determining the Game of the Year for video games. Yes, Jeff Keighley runs the Game Awards, and I don't mean to undermine them as a collective effort to raise video games to the level of other kinds of entertainment, but without any actual authoritative or independent body providing officialdom, it really does boil down to just the opinions of Jeff and the people willing to fund his event. One way the Game Awards does mirror other awards shows is in the claims of bias and unfairness in determining the winners for various awards. In 2022, a lot of people felt Elden Ring was unfairly awarded Game of the Year when God of War Ragnarok came out that same year. In 2023, many people pointed to the very buggy launch of Baldur's Gate 3 as well as the weaker Act 3 as a reason that Alan Wake 2 should have won, and this last year everyone had different arguments for why their favorite game should have beaten Astrobot. When you boil it down, it's impossible to come up with truly objective metrics to determine what makes one game better than others. Despite easy comparisons that can be made, no two video games are ever completely alike, and their purpose, metatext, and content can be interpreted in as many ways as there are people to play them. My personal hill I fought on for the 2024 Game Awards was in the Best RPG category, where, in my opinion, Dragon's Dogma 2 didn't have a chance. Shadow of the Erdtree probably wasn't good enough to take it, and Final Fantasy VII was just slightly too far off the mark to cinch it. I, in my naivety, had a flicker of hope that Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth would have a shot at winning something this year, but the game that won the award was Metaphor Refuntatio. This video is going to be about Metaphor, because while I loved and had more fun with Infinite Wealth as a game, as I finally got around to finishing Metaphor, I could finally accept that yes, Metaphor is a better game, for some very, very good reasons. If you're concerned about spoilers for Metaphor, please just don't watch. This is a full spoiler review and analysis of the game, but if you're concerned about spoilers for Infinite Wealth, don't worry, because I'm only going to talk about it in broad strokes and only at the end. The goal of this video is primarily to clear my hard drive of the 368 gigabytes of storage all the footage I have from Metaphor currently occupies. But I also wanted to demonstrate why my opinion has changed and why I think Metaphor did in fact deserve to be RPG of the Year in 2024. To give a little context to some of my bias against Metaphor, my first encounter with an Atlas RPG was Persona 5, back in about 2018. I played some Final Fantasy games growing up and was pretty mid on turn-based games overall, because my reaction speed was always much faster than my strategizing in video games, but I gave it a shot based on the glowing reviews and the promise that it was a different kind of turn-based game. To my surprise, it was a different kind of turn-based game. Having mana be the main limiting factor for how long you can stay out in the field rather than health or other markers offered a great deal of depth to the exploration of dungeons, and the addition of using guns for completely free but very limited instant damage was honestly mind-blowing to me in making the actual turn-based combat much more engaging. However, two major things and one minor thing really crashed my ability to enjoy the game. Minorly, I don't love the time management elements, because it gives me major anxiety to think that, had I done 3 things differently 40 hours ago, I could have avoided the crushing defeat I'm experiencing now. And given that, while I was in college, my time was already extremely limited between part-time work and classes, I just couldn't cope with a game that gave me that much decision paralysis. Majorly, though, I had heard so many great things about the story of Persona 5, but the further I got into the game, the more consistently disappointed I was by the story they were presenting. I was expecting some actual interrogation of the human psyche given the promise of mementos, a realm occupied by the unconscious minds of every human being. But instead, all there was a bunch of teenage angsty rebellion and mediocre symbolism carried by some okay creativity and level design. The framing narrative of the game being Joker already being captured and telling the story to the investigator is creative, but all of the cuts back to the present just consistently felt meaningless and annoying. To be clear, I stopped playing after I got nearly to the end of Art Guy's Palace of Heart because I couldn't bring myself to care about the story, and I had other games I was more interested in playing. The second, more complicated issue is best exemplified by Morgana as a character, but it's pervasive throughout the game that sexuality and the sexualization of especially women in the game made me really uncomfortable. Not having finished the game, I don't feel qualified to say one way or another whether the game successfully challenges misogyny and sexism, but after about the 30th time of hearing Morgana say,
"You're so gorgeous, Panther,"
I had to sit and think about whether this game was really worth getting further into. There aren't many anime or anime-adjacent properties that really navigate the line of teenagers being permitted to be sexual beings without overly sexualizing the characters themselves, and I really doubt that Persona 5 is exceptional in that case, given what I've played through and what I've read about the game. The whole jazz noir tone of the game strongly invites sexuality to be a major element in it, but again, it doesn't really feel like they tried very hard to avoid making it a location for enjoyment for the people like Kamoshida who inevitably will play the game. My overall negative and dismissive experience with Persona 5 meant that when Metaphor was announced at the 2023 Xbox Games Showcase and later featured at the Game Awards that year, I was skeptical at best and just dismissed it as a Persona clone game, kinda like how Persona is a clone of Shin Megami Tensei. I had assumed it was going to be just a reskin of Persona's over-sexualization of characters and meaningless story that only mattered if you cared about the characters, and I really didn't care about the characters. It took both the constant positive noise of content creators and the chance to play the game for free courtesy of Steam Family Library sharing for me to actually give the game a fair chance, all of which to say that I started off very biased against Metaphor from the start. The key element of the game that overcame that bias was, for lack of a better term, the self-respect that the game has. Recently demonstrated with Clair Obscur Expedition 33, but throughout all games trying to tell a story completely divorced from reality, the most successful of the bunch don't feel the need to justify the language needed to explain what's common in their worlds. Cultural and magical terms are used immediately and consistently, expecting you, the player, to step up and understand it, rather than feeling the need to explain itself to you. All throughout Persona 5, it felt like everything was casually and meaninglessly thrown together to create something flashy and appealing, depending on the vibe and the tone to carry the viewer rather than actual substance. But from the first cutscene, where Igniters and Clamars and Magla are mentioned with no real explanations, it was clear that I was going to be rewarded for my effort to understand this game from the start. The symbolic outstretched hand of invitation to engage with the world of the game from the get-go marked something significantly more substantive than what I found lacking in Persona 5, and the consistently rewarding world carried me nearly to the end of the game on its own merits. Metaphor Fantasio is a game with a message, and one that was remarkably worth taking the time to understand. Now, maybe you all are smarter than me, because it did take me a bit to figure out just how on the nose the name Metaphor was, as I'm well used to video games or animes taking simple words out of context as titles and using them only nominally throughout the game. There are a lot of metaphors in the game, and they all tie back to the idea that eventually becomes the primary theme of the game: anxiety. On the surface, the first prominent element of the game's conceit is tackling the idea of racism, because the player character is part of the Elden race, the only racial group in the world that doesn't have some distinguishing physical characteristic, and therefore looks the closest to the human beings of our world. Throughout the intro chapters of the game, everyone looks at you with fear and mistrust because you're an Elda, who are distinguished because of their innate ability to use magic without an igniter, which goes against the teachings of the mainstream religion, Sanctism. The game puts you into the position of being the subject of prejudice, and thus begins the racial metaphor. It doesn't stop there, though, because the Elda are the only race facing persecution. Broadly speaking, the upper class races include Clamars, Rogues, Ishkia, and the Rusant, representatives of which occupy the highest positions in the government, the military, and the Sanctist Church. On the bottom, there are two distinctions. The Parapus tribe make up the bulk of the exploited labor class in urban areas, but the Nidia and the Ujif tribes are largely excluded from society writ large due to their more stark physical differences, as well as the Mustari tribe being denigrated for being pagans. There are many story and world-building beats where we see especially Parapus, but often the Mustari and Ujif as well, being victims of racial and social prejudice. The distinct stratification of society and Metaphor provides the framework for a thorough examination of how racism affects the victims and is sustained by collective reinforcement and individual anxiety, and allows for a meaningful, if somewhat incomplete, interrogation of the systems that perpetuate racism throughout the world of the game. Another prominent metaphor revolves around a particular ritual of the Sanctist Church. In the game, Sanctism is more of a political mechanism than a religion, and while the pre-game explanation points out that no particular religion or group is intended to be the direct parallel, it's not hard to draw connections between the Sanctists' monotheistic belief that faith in the true God will lead to salvation, and the widespread Christian belief that a professed faith in Christ will lead to salvation independent of other acts performed or sins committed. The primary prayer in Sanctism is performed simply by raising both hands to your head and covering your eyes with the backs of your hands while saying the word "closure." Again, it missed me the first couple of times, but in Metaphor, the Sanctist faith is defined by the desire to close your eyes to the realities of the world and expect faith to counteract the anxiety of engaging with everyday life. As far as I could tell, the game never seeks to punish or decry having faith as evil, but it does make it very clear that clinging to ideals is not an acceptable reason to reject the anxieties brought on by reality, and that closing your eyes to a problem cannot make it go away. Faith can be used to engage with anxiety, but it can't be a drug that cures it, per se. Given how much went over my head originally, I wouldn't be surprised if there are more little examples that I missed in my playing of the game, so feel free to inform me of anything you saw as metaphorical from the game in the comments. But in my opinion, the primary reason the game has Metaphor as its title relates to two specific characters: the stranger who resides in academia, Moore, and the king whose death sets much of the game into motion. When you first meet Moore, it comes about because of a connection you feel through the book that he claims to be the author of. The story is of a fictional utopia, with art and descriptions that are meant to parallel the realities of our day-to-day lives on Earth, presented as a travel log from Moore's wanderings around the world in his youth. However, because of the radical ideas presented therein, the king locked him away in academia, and he has since forgotten where in the physical world his prison resides. Now, on Earth, in England in the year 1516, there lived a man named Thomas More, a writer, friend to King Henry VIII and a devout Catholic. He wrote a book called Utopia, which describes the fictitious conversation between himself and a man named Raphael Hythloday, who describes his journey to the eponymous kingdom and the political and social systems that govern the region. Originally written in Latin, most of the names used throughout can be traced through Greek roots to be oxymoronic names, such as another local region named Akara, meaning no land, and the river Anadrus, meaning no water. While readers of both Greek and Latin could clearly pick up on the theme of self-contradiction, when translated in English, much of the nuance there was lost, and it's led to some discussion of whether Moore was actually trying to articulate his views on what an ideal world would look like. The word utopia especially complicates this, as in English it sounds like the Greek for happy place instead of the intended word no place. This has led to people coming up with both utopian and dystopian literature revolving around the contradiction of utopia, being places where some view it as perfect while others suffer at the hands of the inherent flaws. The name Moore could simply be a coincidence, and that coincidence could even stretch further to the idea that someone named Moore could write a book about a fantastical utopia, but the game makes it very clear from whence their inspiration comes, as the name of the king in metaphor is Hythlodius V, clearly referencing Raphael Hythloday from Utopia, whose name in Greek literally means one who sells nonsense, and that the royal crown looks remarkably like a jester's hat, marking the king as a fool. It's later revealed that Moore is in truth a divested part of the king's spirit, the part of him that originally believed in dreams and in hope, that became locked away at some point because of the king's choice to abandon the beliefs that once drove him to seek a socially unified kingdom. Moore presents the player character, who we learn is actually the Lost Prince through magical bullshit, with the opportunity to abandon the world of the game in a last-ditch effort to save the life of his son and allow him to live in a world free from the devastating conflict the primary antagonist, Luis, is trying to create in the world. If you accept the offer and, like the king, choose to abandon the belief in a better world from mere security, the statement, "fantasy is only fiction," is the game over screen you get. However, when you reject him, you eventually overcome Luis's gambit and become crowned King of Uchronia, which name means a time of utopia or perfection. And while the crown is still that of a jester, it becomes instead the crown of a fool who chooses to believe that fantasy can make the world a better place, if only imperfectly. Arguably, the most important point the game tries to make is that to the player character, the world of the book, which is our world, our Earth, is every bit as flawed and incomplete a utopia as the world the real Thomas More wrote about in his novel. However, the belief in a utopia, the belief that the world can be a better place than it is, can be the catalyst that gives us the power to make the world better than it is. It is foolish to believe in certain ideals, and it is foolish to commit wholeheartedly to acting in the name of changing the world, but it is exactly those kinds of fools who make their mark on the world and make the world a place worth believing in. As always, it's one thing to come up with an idea like this when chatting around the table with some friends, and it's wholly another to actually pull it off in a successful metaphor that also happens to be an extremely creative and fun video game at the same time. So now let's talk about anxiety. In common parlance, anxiety can be defined in many ways, but it's most typified by a strong level of stress regarding something seen but unknown or unseen and present. We talk about it in terms of social anxiety, where you're scared to interact because you don't want to interact in the wrong way. We talk about having anxiety attacks, where you suddenly feel overwhelmingly stressed or scared and don't understand why. And we also talk about it as simple nervousness, like with waiting to get a test or assignment graded. I don't have a singular definition of anxiety, partially because I'm not a psychiatrist, and partially because we each experience anxiety differently, but anxiety in one way or another is a fairly universal experience. Metaphor primarily deals with two kinds of anxiety: the anxiety of individual to others, and a kind of collective social anxiety toward political systems. First, in context of individual anxiety toward others, the foundational function anxiety plays in the theming of metaphor is a fact we learn about it partway through the game. Once much of the plot is revealed at the Elven Sanctuary, we learn that Magla, the principal source of magic in the world, is manifested as a result of the experience of anxiety, and that an unreleased and untreated excess of anxiety can cause a process known as melancholization, creating monsters out of normal people. This same force that can empower and enable people to accomplish great feats both magical and martial also has the power to cause people to withdraw, to lose their connection, and to become malevolent, blinded by their own fears, grief, or pain. Connected to this, the crux of both combat and follower storytelling in the game revolves around selecting and channeling different archetypes for your characters. Each archetype is representative of various classes or character tropes common to heroic storytelling, such as warrior or healer, and determines what powers and stats a character will have. Whenever you channel an archetype, which makes it available for the character to equip, the voices of the heroes who have embodied that archetype in the past speak, starting with the phrase, "O worthy heart who tempers anxiety into strength." Throughout the game, every character we meet falls into one of two camps. Either they give in to their anxiety and become controlled by their fears, or they choose to confront their anxiety and temper it into strength. This is manifested through playable character archetypes, yes, but it's also manifested by people like Rella, Batlin, Nuris, and Barden, people who are given many chances to give in to insecurity, to self-doubt, to the anxiety that they're not good enough to continue on their chosen path, but they continue to choose to become better despite their anxieties and fears. The choice to temper anxiety into strength is the choice made by the player character, as well as the followers who unite under their banner and ideals. As you progress through the game, you're given opportunities to strengthen your bonds with your followers by participating in very Persona-esque bonding moments with them, which are usually a mix of learning their personal history, intervening when trouble arises in the present, and discussing their goals and dreams for the future. As the theme of anxiety becomes more present throughout the game, it becomes very easy to see how these follower stories are showcasing different ways that the characters, having accepted the call to embrace the archetypes, are now forced to confront their anxiety rather than allow it to control them. Yufa is the most clear example for sure. Prior to her joining your cause, she, as the high priestess of the Mustari people, goes to sacrifice herself to appease the dragon who is causing cataclysmic problems with the Mustari island. When the party reaches her, she tries to insist on the right to sacrifice herself, thinking it's the only thing she can do to protect her people. However, as they clear the overwhelming Magla and help her to see clearly, she realizes that her willingness to sacrifice herself for her people was rooted in the fear that she had no power to protect them in other ways. And it's when she acknowledges and accepts that fear that she awakens to her archetype and the dramatic power that it holds. After joining up, her follower events revolve around a small sanctist church in Brilehaven, where a very young child is learning to pray as a demonstration of faith, hoping that it will heal her sick mother. However, due to Yupa's native ability to perceive Magla, she discovers that the room they're keeping the sick people in is dangerously full of it due to the anxiety of their prayers, and when she confronts the priest in charge, he rejects her counsel and instead takes the sick people hostage as he goes to perform a healing ritual in a volcano. When the party arrives, the priest has already given in to melancholization, but they get there in time to save the girl's mother and the rest of the patients. And when they remove them from the dark place they were being kept in, they start to recover and heal from their sicknesses. Yufa had been blinded by her anxiety and compelled to mistakenly give up her life to help her people. Now, she sees someone else giving in to anxiety in the same way. Having accepted the power of the archetypes, she now chooses to run headlong at things that might once have paralyzed her, and chooses to act instead of allowing circumstances to act upon her and those she cares for. Instead of being stopped by it, her anxiety now pushes her forward in compassion. Not to belabor the point, but besides all the metaphors about racism and ideals, the main thing the storytellers behind the game want you to know is that anxiety can only control you so far as you allow it to. For every choice and interaction you'll ever have, there will be unknowns and often very rational fears present, and it can be very easy to let those fears paralyze you. However, it is possible that you can choose to accept those fears and the risks they represent and choose to walk forward in spite of them. The heroes of the game constantly make mistakes, sometimes extremely serious ones, but the thing that sets them apart is that they never give up on their goals. Even when they falter, even when people get hurt, they own up to their choices and continue to get better, knowing that there will never be a perfect time to start because there will always be risks involved in any attempt to make the world or your life better. Anxiety has the power to cripple and paralyze if you give in to it, but it also has the power to motivate and direct you to the things you truly want if you're only willing to embrace the things you fear as something to acknowledge, but not accept about yourself and your circumstances. Anyway, the second kind of anxiety comes up mostly at the end of the game, but the plot of the game builds towards it via the competition throughout focused around who will be the next king. NPCs in every town will constantly express their opinions about who should be king and why, and while at the start they're the usual kind of "I like this guy because X" or "anyone who supports Y is an idiot," the tone of their comments changes as the conflict between the player character and Luis increases in intensity. They turn from pithy, meaningless commentary to actual expressions of their fear and their anxiety, to things like "if Luis becomes king," or "what's going to happen to us?" In the build-up to the final confrontation with Luis, he explains the big secret behind the power kings of Uchronia have used to govern for the last 7 centuries. The famous royal magic is capable of destroying armies, reshaping the land, and other feats of cataclysmic strength. And Luis reveals that this power isn't actually a product of the royal scepter, nor was it a magical consequence of the king's bloodline, but instead the result of the scepter gathering and channeling the magla, aka anxiety, of the citizens of Uchronia into a usable form. His grand plan is to turn that magla back onto the people, causing them either to break and turn into monsters, or overcome and be part of his new world. Obviously this doesn't happen, but the connection between the people and the position of the king calls to mind another famous English writer. Thomas Hobbes wrote a treatise on government called Leviathan, where he explains the formative role the governmental sovereign has in constituting the citizens of their kingdom, and the role of the citizens in creating and sustaining the sovereign. I'm a little less familiar with this text than I am with Utopia, but what stuck with me through the years since reading it is the art on the cover made by Abraham Boss. The sovereign is depicted with a sword and a scepter in hand, and their body is formed out of countless individuals all looking up toward the head. In metaphor, in a literal sense, the power the king wields is only through the consent of the governed. This astronomical strength comes because the people literally support the king through the giving up of their anxiety to him. Instead of being entirely self-governed, they accept being constituted through a sovereign in exchange for a relief from their anxiety, and in many cases seem to completely give up when faced with any political issue that might actually ask something of them personally. Luis is critical of this perspective, considering it a cowardice that can't be condoned, motivating his desire to turn their anxiety back to them. The player character and the party acknowledge the weakness of the system, especially in the way it imbalances power into the hands of one person who may or may not be someone trustworthy, but they also emphasize the balance between the governed and those who govern. It's only by consistently demonstrating trustworthiness that those in positions of authority should be allowed to govern. Part of the utopic ideal they're striving for includes making a world where all people are valued regardless of their own individual strength, and that means there has to be provisions made for those who can't handle the anxieties of governance. So the player character takes up the position of being the king with a great obligation to those who have elected him to the position. Again, I think Metaphor is pointing toward an ideal more than specifically advocating a monarchy, especially because we have no IRL system to magically validate the support and allegiances of the governed, but recognizing our own accountability in terms of our political anxiety is an important thing to keep in mind. Anxiety mostly comes up in the second half of the game, but it really takes precedence over nearly everything else in the story when it does. It mostly works, but I do find it a little tacky how the main cast all kind of become therapists by the end of the game, moralizing a lot about how they personally deal with anxiety, but that is kind of just the name of the game overall, so it is mostly forgivable. It's a meaningful point in a world allegorically exploring our own, where people retreat into phobia and derision when they can't accept their fears about the unknown. And I think having a widely varied cast of characters all expressing their own versions of the same truths is a good way to help people come to terms with their own struggle with anxiety. The level of commitment the developers of this game have to understanding and trying to communicate to the player of their game is genuinely touching to think about, because again, the Herculean undertaking to make a dozen or so significant personal histories all trying to communicate the same underlying principle is no joke. There are a few miscellaneous things I'd like to cover with this last segment, and they all kind of fit under the umbrella of the game's structure. First and foremost, I have 2 gripes, both minor, but one indicative of a larger overall complaint. The first minor one, I get frustrated at little things in video games pretty easily, so maybe other people didn't mind this as much, but with the battle retry mechanic, I discovered as I was trying to steal items from enemies that if you try to restart, the battle won't load back in until after voice lines are all finished. This is fine, it's not necessarily the kind of thing you look for in bug testing and optimization, but when you're trying to steal an item with Heisme and Juna is your second fastest character, sometimes you have to listen through all of this before getting to try again.
I've got just the dance for you. You might say it's to die for.
I repeat, it's not really a huge problem, but it's the kind of thing that I'd rather have interrupted than need to listen to every time. The other gripe is about doors. There are a lot of differences that can be remarkably subtle in the way you program a player's ability to interact with the world in a video game. Sometimes you locate by proximity to the player, sometimes you have a separate object dedicated to looking at things, and sometimes you want things quick and easy so you tie it all to the camera. That's what Metaphor did, and the problem with this is that the camera pans very slowly compared to most action RPGs, so whenever you want to go purify a piece of gear at the Sanctus Church, you spawn in facing the guy, then have to slowly pan the camera around before the prompt to exit shows up, because if the door isn't seen by the camera, it doesn't exist as an interactable object. This problem ties in with a bigger concern about the game writ large. Not big enough to defeat the praise the game deserves, but enough to make you think about whether it could have been full Game of the Year material if it had been a little different. You see, one of the rarest achievements on Steam at least is the achievement to sword surf a considerable distance. On the surface, one might think, I don't get it, that's so easy, why wouldn't people get the achievement to move more quickly? But the ugly truth of the matter is that the overworld in Metaphor is secretly nothing more than one big menu to walk around in. Yes, there are golden bugs to find in some places, yes, there are quests and dialogue and cool things to look at, but functionally, what's the point of riding around on a sword when you can fast travel to 95% of the important places you might want to get to? Most quests even let you fast travel directly to the quest giver, and once you talk to them, usually it's just back to the Gauntlet runner or talking to another follower to progress the time forward. I can't stress this enough, the game takes itself very seriously and wants the stakes for characters to be the same as its stakes for the player, but it was a downer when I realized that the world wasn't going to be a fun place to explore regularly. Again, not enough to undermine the message, but a reason I think that the game didn't qualify for the full Game of the Year award. Another weakness is that there really isn't much in the game that's optional. There are side missions you can do, but they're either just talking missions, go to a dungeon and get an item missions, or essentially just bonus stuff for the main mission, and none of them are really meaningful stories either. There aren't any little games or things you can do that don't progress the time in the game, and while I think that's intentional and fits with the message of the game, it also just makes playing the game feel much more stressful than a video game usually is. Again, I think it was an intentional choice, and I do think it's an effective one, but I had a lot less fun playing the game because everything was consequential. Lastly, I just want to touch lightly on Infinite Wealth's story, because I think both games aim to radically examine society, but go about it in very different ways. Metaphor constructs an elaborate, multi-layered allegory to interrogate prejudice and the responsibility every individual has as part of a political system, whereas Infinite Wealth takes its systemic challenges very personally. It puts the heroes we love at the forefront of genuine issues that aren't talked about in AAA video games very often, like the abuse of criminals, climate change and ecological exploitation, and racial prejudice. It's so far the only AAA game I've ever seen to actually acknowledge that a pandemic occurred and disrupted society for a few years, and has characters who have to reckon with it like we as real people do, and that's pretty radical given how much of society just wants to move on and ignore the consequences of COVID-19. It feels to me like Metaphor is a very intellectual, rational, and eloquent approach to radicality, giving you caricatures more than characters in some ways, personified traits and elements of society to articulate arguments people don't always take the time to consciously engage with. Infinite Wealth, on the other hand, is a very emotional game, giving you deeply complex people with genuine, relatable issues going through the same world you are and going through with a smile, even in the face of extreme, hateful opposition, knowing that the world is good, as are the people in it if you just figure out where to look for it. It shares the message of faith in humanity and its potential with Metaphor, but makes the case by looking at particular humans instead of trying to approach universal humanity. I think the message of Metaphor is effective, but there are times where it really lacks the personal oomph that soapy, overdramatic games like the Like a Dragon franchise has in spades. So to wrap up, Metaphor is a video game that creatively and eloquently weaves a conversation started over 500 years ago into allegorical modern-day contexts, and does so with such beauty that it makes my love for Infinite Wealth and my previous indignance that it didn't win feel a little childish. Infinite Wealth is a fantastic game, and it's definitely one of my favorites of the franchise, but while it was an excellent Like a Dragon game, Metaphor was a better game overall. Atlus and Studio Zero spared no expense and covered every base in trying to create a whole new world to tell a single story of overcoming anxiety and making the world a better place, showing you, the player, that it can be done, and it certainly deserved to win a Game of the Year.